Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from Spyscape Studios. The Traitor of Arnhem. September 17th, 1944. Over the skies of Holland, the biggest aerial invasion in history is underway. More than 40,000 British and American troops in over 3,000 aircraft are preparing to parachute 60 miles into Nazi-occupied Dutch territory, tasked with taking key strategic bridges along the River Rhine.
Eindhoven first, then Nijmegen, and the final bridge was Arnhem.
Once the bridges are secured, some 20,000 ground troops in thousands of tanks and light vehicles will advance down Hell's Highway through Holland and secure the positions. The operation is audacious in the extreme, matching D-Day for ambition and sheer scale. Its name? Market Garden.
Catapulting a British and American force around the Siegfried Line. We would then capture the Ruhr industrial part of Nazi Germany and advance on to Berlin, beating the Russians to Berlin, winning the war before Christmas.
British Prime Minister Winston Churchill knows that getting to Berlin before the Russians will change the course of European history. It's his best chance of stopping a communist Iron Curtain coming down over much of the continent after the conflict. The future of the entire geopolitical landscape hinges on Market Garden.
British intelligence suggested that there was a very sort of weak German presence in Holland. They expected the Germans to roll over, really. There was a belief that the Germans were broken, they were a beaten force. There were no substantial German armour in the area.
As the armada above reaches its target, tens of thousands of British and American paratroopers litter the sky, sure that victory will soon be theirs.
But right from the word go, the operation ran into trouble.
As the paratroopers near the ground, they face incessant fire.
Germans had 2 SS Panzer divisions in the Arnhem area.
Led by German General Kurt Student, an early pioneer of airborne warfare, the German SS divisions machine gun the landing paratroopers from hedgerows and tree lines. In open fields, British and American soldiers are dropping everywhere. Thousands killed within a few hours. And back west, the Allies' tank crusade is going no better.
There were camouflaged German anti-tank units hiding in the woods, and they were using these Panzer Force anti-tank guns. 9 tanks are taken out immediately, and for the rest of the column to advance, they have to knock them off the road.
The armoured column was meant to motor 60 miles in 48 hours to the rendezvous. Instead, they managed just 8 miles on the first day, leaving stranded the several paratroop units that do manage to reach their target bridges.
And although they bravely held on for 4 days, they were expected to hold on for 2 days, British Armour 30 Corps never reached them. And in the end, they were forced to surrender, and Market Garden was a disaster. It didn't shorten the war. It merely gave the Germans a victory that they weren't expecting. It was, in fact, the last Allied defeat of the Second World War and the last German victory of the Second World War. It was an extraordinary upset.
Over 17,000 British and American soldiers were killed or captured in Market Garden. The Nazis held on in Holland for several more months, starving 20,000 civilians to death during that time. And more than that,
allowed Stalin and his Red Army to enter Berlin and take it without any concern that British or Americans would get there before him.
Despite the disastrous outcome, British Field Marshal Montgomery said Market Garden was 90% successful, which led the Dutch Prince Bernhard to quip that
Holland cannot afford another one of Montgomery's famous victories.
The defeat was immortalized in the 1976 film A Bridge Too Far, and more recently in The Traitor of Arnhem, a book by Robert Verkaik, who's our guide to this story. To Robert, and to some in Allied command, the fierce German resistance that the Allies encountered seemed almost too well prepared, too well positioned to have been mere coincidence. Did the Germans know about Market Garden beforehand? Was there a mole who could have given up intel on one of the war's most secretive and crucial operations? In this episode of True Spies, you'll hear about the double agents suspected of betraying Market Garden, stopping the British and American advance on Berlin in its tracks, and allowing the Russians to put a huge swathe of Europe under communist rule, shaping the world as we know it today.
It was a most precise but extraordinarily unusual piece of intelligence that turned up in Berlin on the day before Arnhem.
Including one spy who's hardly been mentioned by historians. Their codename? Agent Josephine. An alias that masks a true name lost to time. Or does it? Well, in this episode of True Spies, you'll also hear just who it might be.
You come across something that's never really been discussed before or known about, and that was the British attempt to find out who Josephine was.
When the Nazis swept into Holland in the summer of 1940, one man was not prepared to take it lying down.
As a sort of mythical figure in terms of Dutch resistance. He was a larger-than-life character. He carried a machine gun in his briefcase and grenades in his pocket. He was very quick to lose his temper.
Christian Lindemans was his name, but a lot of people knew him as King Kong.
Because he had such huge arms. He was a huge man, an awesome figure.
When war broke out, Lindemans started surveilling German ships docking in Rotterdam, sending the intelligence on to the British. Then he built a network of resistance fighters, helping to spirit downed Allied airmen out of Nazi territory.
And he managed to smuggle many British and American airmen back to Britain. So along the way, he received lots of cash from very grateful Dutch refugees who he also smuggled out of Holland.
Pretty soon, Lindemans had made a name for himself. To the Dutch, he was a hero, and to the Nazis, a wanted man.
But he sort of lived a charmed life, and the Germans, they couldn't really catch him.
As the war progressed, Lindemans operated across Europe, setting up bases in Paris, Brussels, Bordeaux, and Lille. He took lovers everywhere, but it was a French nightclub singer and resistance fighter who took his heart, Gilou Le Top. Together, they smuggled hundreds of people into neutral Spain and out of Nazi hands. But in February 1944, the realities of resistance finally caught up with Lindemans. Marching into a hotel in Paris's 9th arrondissement, 2 Gestapo agents arrested Gilou, now his wife. Finding stolen German ID cards, boxes of ammunition and a pistol, the Gestapo sent her to the city's Fort de Romainville, now an infamous Nazi concentration camp. And not only that, Lindemann's brother was also captured. Desperate, King Kong went against everything he'd fought for throughout the war.
He voluntarily arranged a meeting with the head of German military intelligence, Hermann Gisks, who was based in Brussels at the time, and he offered Gisks a deal.
"Release my brother and wife, and I'll work for you," he says. "I know more about the resistance than you could possibly imagine."
Gisks was extraordinarily surprised by this, but he looked at Lindemann's and said, what have I got to lose? I'll do the deal.
It was a deal that would open the floodgates for German counterintelligence.
And very shortly after that, Lindemann's started betraying literally hundreds of resistance fighters. The names, the tip-offs, the addresses that he handed over to the Germans allowed them to pick up literally hundreds of very brave resistance fighters. And he became an extraordinarily useful double agent, pretending to work for the British, really working for the Germans.
Quickly, Lindemann's became his German handler Gisks' most valuable asset. And as the summer of 1944 drew closer, there was one thing in particular that he, and just about every other Nazi, wanted to know more than anything.
He was pretty certain that Lindemann's would be able to tell him all about D-Day. They called it X-Day or DX, and they wanted to know where it was, when it was, as much detail as possible.
With D-Day looming, the Allies engaged in one of the biggest subterfuge operations in history. Using spies like Juan Pujol Garcia, who you can hear all about in the True Spies episode Agent Garbo, they planted misinformation everywhere about the impending Allied invasion. One such nugget of bad intel was that
Normandy is not the intended target. It's not the main invasion. Will be in the Pas de Calais.
Another claimed that Norway was the real landing site. All this to scatter German forces away from the actual invasion point around Normandy. And it was phenomenally successful. The Germans took the bait. Thinking the Normandy landings would be, at best, a feint, they kept several divisions further east, waiting for another invasion that never came. All despite Lindemann's telling the Germans that Normandy, from the intelligence he could gather, may in fact be the real deal.
Lindemann's came up with a pretty good idea of what British were planning, but it wasn't accurate enough. But nevertheless, it still, in the eyes of the Germans, made him look like a very effective spy.
After the success of D-Day, the Allies ripped through northern France at an electrifying pace.
They believed they could finish the war by Christmas.
And in believing that, Field Marshal Montgomery hatches Operation Market Garden, with Lindemann's a key component.
Lindemann's had been instructed by the British to take part in a very secret operation.
He was still their man in the eyes of the British, after all.
On the eve of Market Garden, he was sent into Eindhoven to alert the resistance to the fact that Operation Market Garden was about to begin and that they should prepare themselves to take on the Germans in the streets when the British arrived.
A few days before Market Garden is set to commence, Lindemann's approaches the front line near Eindhoven. Under a barrage of shell fire, in full British uniform, he manages to surrender to the Germans.
Saying, look, I'm King Kong, the famous agent who worked for Hermann Gisks. I've got some very important intelligence for you. He told the Germans that the British had 450 guns, 300 tanks just outside Eindhoven. They were about to launch an airborne invasion, although he wasn't sure that it was Arnhem, but he was certain that it was around Eindhoven and possibly Nijmegen. And he told them exactly when it was going to happen. It was vital intelligence.
Now the Germans knew about Market Garden. 2 SS Panzer divisions, regrouping in the area, are put on alert, while units are redeployed to the expected target bridges. And so, thousands of Allied troops parachute into Holland. Many are killed before they even hit the ground, as the Nazis pick them off at will. The carnage that follows marks one of Germany's greatest and most surprising victories of the war. In the aftermath, Lindemann's Nazi handlers thank him for his efforts and then let him go. They still want the Allies to think King Kong is still their man. When he does eventually link back up with the Dutch resistance cell, Lindemann's immediately falls under suspicion.
And they search him and they find that he's got a German pass on him, and he's also got a letter written by a German intelligence officer. So they suspect him of being a German traitor. They find out that he's carrying incriminating documentation. So they arrest him and hold him.
It looked like the game might be up for King Kong. That is, until his British handlers arrive a few days later.
They're very angry that he's been captured because he's considered their top operator, and they release him, despite the incriminating evidence and protests from the Dutch.
Lindemann's had an ace in the hole. Back when he was smuggling anti-Nazi fighters out of enemy territory, one man in particular never forgot the debt he owed King Kong. A Dutchman named de Graaf might have been just one of the hundreds Lindemann's helped. But now he was aide-de-camp to the Dutch Prince Bernhard of Lippe-Biesterfeld himself, working with the British. And to the prince, King Kong was a hero.
So he's got lots of friends in very high places who are able to protect him, even when some of the evidence against him seems pretty damning.
Besides, Lindemann's had proven his loyalty time and again to the Allies. In the battles for Antwerp and Brussels, he'd personally gunned down tens of Nazi soldiers. Surely there was no way he could be in hock to the Germans. In fact, even Lindemann's German handlers couldn't quite believe he was still working with them.
After all that, he returns to the Germans. He returns to Hermann Gisks, his spy handler, and continues to feed him with intelligence. And Gisks is as amazed as anybody else would have been. Why would Lindemann's be fighting for the Germans at this juncture in the war when it's clear the Germans are going to lose? It would have been much easier for Lindemann's to just sort of drift off and carry on fighting with the successful Allied forces who were clearly going to win the war.
It turned out that loyalty to his wife and brother wasn't the only thing driving Lindemann's to work against the British as the war drew to a close. That started to become clear 6 weeks after the calamity at Market Garden, when Lindemann's was finally burned. A fellow Dutch traitor, now captured by the British, gave him up as a Nazi double agent.
And very soon it's clear that Lindemann's is the Traitor of Arnhem. And he's arrested. He's sent to Britain, where he's held in a interrogation camp known as O20, which is where we interrogated all the top German spies. And during that interrogation, it's established that he did pass on vital intelligence to the Germans.
The British turned Lindemann's over to the Dutch at the war's end. But under interrogation there, a whole other dimension to King Kong's treachery appears.
Lindemann's is actually a treble agent. He wasn't just working for the British and the Germans. He was also working for the Russians, and perhaps ultimately working for the Russians. And so perhaps the true point of his treachery is to help the Russians in the sort of run-up to the end of the war. And his role, perhaps seen in that context, is much more important. And we can see now that perhaps he played a more critical part in Stalin's advance on Berlin, served Russian interests rather than German interests. Although, of course, by helping the Germans, he was helping the Russians.
After all, helping the Germans slow the British advance on the Western Front paved the way for Stalin to enter Berlin, claiming much of Europe for his brand of totalitarian communism. Admitting he is ultimately a Russian agent, Lindemann strikes a plea deal with the Western Allies.
He's still trying to save his own neck. And what he does is he gives the British a list of Soviet agents who he says have infiltrated the Dutch and Belgian governments.
Before the case can go much further, though, Lindemann's is dead. At first, it looks like suicide.
July 1946, his cell is searched by some of the jailers. They search his cell and they find his body on his bed, almost lifeless, with the nurse who was supposed to be looking after him draped over him. So the two of them there. And it looks like there's been some sort of suicide pact. She actually survives. He's found to have died. And the official report was one that he took his own life, and they find a suicide note to that effect.
But the reality was rather different.
Later, it also transpires after documents are released by the Dutch archives that arsenic was also found in his body. So the suicide theory kind of falls by the wayside, and we're left with the idea that he was perhaps murdered. And who were the prime suspects for a murder? Well, it has to be the Russians.
The Russian angle was the startling new revelation Robert Verkaik had planned to write about in his new book on Lindemann's, the man who history tells us betrayed Arnhem. But the more he looked, the more Robert was dragged in another direction.
I discovered there wasn't just one warning. Lindemann's was not the only one who warned the Germans about Operation Market Garden. Turns out that the day before the operation, the Germans received another warning from another agent who gave them much more detail about Operation Market Garden, in quite extraordinary detail, in fact, which identified the 3 airborne divisions. The Americans, it numbered them, so it said it was the 82nd and the 104th Airborne Division. It said that there was the British 1st Division would be involved. The report said that on the 17th of September 1944, there would be an attack on Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and ultimately Arnhem. And the point of this was to sidestep the Siegfried Line and go on to capture Berlin. And it was a most precise but extraordinarily unusual piece of intelligence. And that's what sent me off in a parallel direction, if you like, another warning.
And this second warning led Robert somewhere almost unbelievable.
The heart of the British establishment.
The second spy's codename? Agent Josephine. December 23rd, 1943, London. At the Reform Club on Pall Mall, MI6 officer Peter Falk is in a private dining room sharing details of a top-secret operation with a colleague from MI5, the British Security Service. For several years, MI6 have suspected, along with the Americans, that there's a mole in the British government. I think this mole is a Soviet double agent, Falk says to his fellow diner, who, uncharacteristically, loses his cool.
And says there's no way that the Russians would be able to get hold of this kind of material. It's absolute rubbish. Don't worry, leave it all with me. I'll sort it out.
The mole the information concerns is Agent Josephine. Nothing comes of the suggestion, though. The MI5 man takes Falk's intel and buries it, having the power to do as he pleases.
He was extraordinarily high up in MI5. He was in charge of the sharing of intelligence between MI5 and MI6 and Bletchley Park, where all the Ultra material, all the decoded Enigma files were kept. He was a very influential and effective military intelligence officer, or MI5 officer, who happened to be working for the Russians.
His name? Anthony Blunt, one of the famous Cambridge spy ring. Blunt became so senior in British intelligence that he ended up writing briefings for Churchill's eyes only. And while he was doing that, Blunt was also in charge of finding out who this Agent Josephine was, the mole sending what one MI6 officer described as the best intel I've ever seen to the Soviets. But given that Blunt himself was doing the same thing, It's perhaps not surprising that the investigation he led into Josephine went nowhere.
He tries to send everyone off the scent, particularly MI6, by suggesting that one's possible source may be a Swedish diplomat who was the air attaché working in London. And this theory takes on a bit of life of its own.
MI6 eventually conclude that this is a dead end. But they then pinpoint Agent Josephine to a Nazi diplomat and spy master based in Stockholm, one Karl-Heinz Kramer. He is Josephine's handler, MI6 deduce. But MI5 disagree.
MI5 don't believe that Josephine is an agent. They think he's either a useful tool dreamt up by Karl-Heinz Kramer to use as someone who he claims has been reporting to him. But they don't believe that Josephine is anything other than a fictitious figure.
And the man at MI5 pushing the notion that Josephine was simply made up? Anthony Blunt. This cat-and-mouse game goes on for years. By 1944, Josephine has gone quiet. But in the lead-up to D-Day, she, or he, reappears, feeding the Nazis intel that
Normandy is not the intended target. The main invasion will be in the Pas-de-Calais. So at this point in the war, Josephine's intelligence that the Germans should hold back their divisions and wait for the main attack saves D-Day. This is what the Germans believe.
To Robert, this makes perfect sense.
Remember, up until D-Day, the Russians were very keen that the Allies succeeded in establishing this second front. They've been demanding Churchill and Eisenhower get on with a second front. And so up till D-Day, British and Russian ambitions, interests are kind of aligned.
After D-Day, though, Josephine's intelligence to the Nazis changes. He sends Kramer microdots, words and images put together and reduced so much in size that you need a microscope to read them. But to the naked eye, they simply look like black blots on a piece of paper. In one microdot to Kramer in Stockholm, Josephine details exact coordinates of each of the Allied airborne divisions during Market Garden. Kramer forwards the information on to Berlin, where head of Nazi intelligence Walter Schellenberg immediately recognizes its value.
And it helped the Germans appreciate what the British and Americans were trying to do during Operation Market Garden. And it allowed Willy Dietrich, who was in charge of the SS Panzer divisions, to deploy them to Nijmegen and Arnhem. And it allowed him to act very quickly in a very confusing battlefield. In Montgomery, in fact, testified to the extraordinary response of the Germans to the British attack. Most British senior officers involved in Arnhem believe that it was the speed of the response that allowed the Germans to win the battle.
Stalin was desperate for the Allies to succeed on D-Day, in the process diverting German forces from the Eastern Front. But he was less keen on the British and Americans advancing much afterward. And with the failure of Market Garden, the road is open for the Russians to take Berlin first. We know the consequences of that.
Josephine warns the Germans about the crossing of the Rhine. We get Arnhem, obviously. Arnhem is clearly not in the interest of the Allies. It's designed to harm the Allies' advance towards Berlin, and also the crossing of the Rhine, which again is vital intelligence.
So by now, you've probably started wondering, was Anthony Blunt Agent Josephine?
The intelligence that led to the warning, Josephine's warning on September the 16th, 1944, it could have only come from a very secure source within British military intelligence or high command.
While the Russians were allied with the British and Americans during the war, they certainly weren't privy to the sort of detailed battle plans we're talking about here.
Karl-Heinz Kramer picked up the intelligence September the 15th in a microdot which arrived through diplomatic mail Operation Market Garden wasn't given the go-ahead until September the 10th. So this key piece of intelligence got to Kramer from Allied Supreme Headquarters within 5 days. Very few people who could have had access to that intelligence and were in a position to supply it to Kramer.
It's the kind of rarefied access that Anthony Blunt, a confirmed Russian double agent, would have had.
In Operation Market Garden, Blunt was the man who was helping to run Brutus, who was an agent who was supposed to warn the Germans about, after Operation Market Garden had taken place, and tell them actually that the British weren't really going for Arnhem. Their intended target was Norway, and to hold back. So Blunt was heavily involved in and had access to the Market Garden secrets.
Then Robert came across a startling discovery when looking into Blunt. Because in November 44, 2 months after the Allied disaster at Arnhem, Blunt gets cold feet.
He meets his handler, Boris Krochin, in London in November 1944. And he tells Krochin, I'm no longer going to work for you. I'm resigning from MI5. I'm resigning from Russian intelligence. I've had enough. I don't want any more to do with you. The reason we know this is because the Russians filed a report on this meeting, as did Blunt. And these were files that turned up in the Moscow archive during Glasnost and Perestroika in the 1990s.
Why would Blunt want out now? To Robert, one possibility is that he's feeling the gravity of what he's done at Arnhem.
The results of which are pretty plain, would have been, I imagine, pretty shocking if he was responsible for that betrayal, because he had blood on his hands. 17,000 British American soldiers lost their lives.
The Russians managed to talk Blunt down.
Persuade him to continue working for them. They end up paying him £100, which is worth many thousands of pounds today. They give him some money, and they also shower him with praise and tell him how valued he is as an agent.
As the Russians take Berlin in April 1945 and war in Europe comes to an end, the paths of the two sources involved in the betrayal of Market Garden unwittingly crossed. At Camp 020, that nondescript, top-secret Victorian house nestled near southwest London's Richmond Park. By mid-1945, both Dutch triple agent Christian Lindemans and Nazi spy master Karl-Heinz Kramer are imprisoned there, the British interrogating them day and night. Lindemans eventually cracks, telling his captors that he was working for the Germans.
It's extraordinarily embarrassing for the British, because he was working for the British while he was doing that, and relations between Britain and the Americans is already strained after Market Garden, an operation that they weren't particularly keen on in the first place. If they were to discover that one of the reasons might have been that it was a British agent who'd betrayed it, that would have been political dynamite, and so this information is suppressed, really.
But with Kramer, the interrogations prove much harder going.
The official verdict on Kramer is that he is, and as they describe him, an inveterate liar.
MI6 are desperate for Kramer to tell them who his agent Josephine is. Yet MI5 are still not convinced Josephine even exists. Perhaps, they theorize, it's just the term Kramer used for specific pieces of intel. Eventually, the interrogation does make a breakthrough, of sorts.
It turns out during the interrogation of Karl-Heinz Kramer that he doesn't really know who Josephine is himself.
Kramer tells them that
all he knows is, in terms of the Arnhem intelligence, that one day it arrived on the 15th of September in a diplomatic bag sent from Berlin via the Hungary delegation. Inside the bag, there's this envelope with these microdots. And incidentally, Blunt is an expert in microdots. But all Kramer knows is that this intelligence has turned up in the diplomatic mail. He doesn't really know the source of the intelligence. He's just simply the beneficiary of the intelligence. But he doesn't really know who is responsible for it. But he's certainly not going to look a gift horse in the mouth.
at this point, the Americans amp up the pressure on the British. They want them to find out the source of the second betrayal at Arnhem, a betrayal that cost thousands of American lives.
The Americans actually start to try and open up the case again just after the war. They interview Kramer's secretary, who was working with him in Sweden, and they tried to crack it open.
They ask MI5 for their files on Kramer, files that were overseen by Anthony Blunt.
But word comes back to them that there's no point in sending you the files because we believe Kramer was an inveterate liar and there's no point in you looking at them again.
Blunt leaves MI5 shortly after the end of the war, closing down the investigation into Josephine in his last act in office.
So he's kind of done his job, Blunt, in that respect. He's killed Josephine.
Nothing more is done about Agent Josephine for decades. In 1964, though, Blunt, like Lindemans before him, is burned, given up by a Russian double agent.
He's dragged kicking and screaming to the confession table, and the only reason he will confess is because Britain offer him immunity from prosecution deal. So he's allowed to get away with it scot-free. But even then, he doesn't say very much. He never says what he did in terms of his betrayal. The reason for that is because in 1964, he's still useful to British intelligence. It's the height of the Cold War. We're still investigating Russians. We want to know the level of the penetration of the Russian Secret Service into MI5 and MI6. And Blunt can help them. He's a valuable asset.
It's not until 10 years later, in the 1970s, that British intelligence reopens the investigation into Josephine in a 300-page document that quietly slipped into the National Archive in 2004.
That's the only document that sort of tries to find out what Josephine was.
Robert Verkaik studied it word for word. Authored by former MI5 officer Pat McCullum, it makes for odd reading.
It takes us through the investigation into Kramer and Josephine. Talks about D-Day, talks about Arnhem. It talks about the only way Josephine could have been doing all the things that Kramer says he was doing, or says she was doing, would be because he was actually working for the British, which she says is a highly ridiculous idea. It doesn't entertain it, really. It just sort of says that for effect, I think.
Blunt was a known Russian double agent deep within British intelligence by the time the report was written. But still, Pat McCullum's report steers clear of implicating the famous mole.
She never says that if we found out a little bit more about Blunt, or even identified Blunt as a Russian agent and then looked at it in that context, perhaps we'd get a bit closer. Which I find it extraordinary because, the intelligence that led to the warning, Josephine's warning on September the 16th, 1944, it could have only come from a very secure source within British military intelligence or high command.
McCullum states that if Josephine was a real person in British intelligence, they almost certainly would have been working in the deception unit, which is exactly where Anthony Blunt worked. Regardless, her conclusion is,
we will probably never ever know.
What we do know is that on the eve of Market Garden, a top-secret operation, one of the most extraordinarily accurate pieces of intel of the entire war, dropped right into the Germans' lap. The airborne units involved, the target bridges, the armoured columns backstopping the drops, everything. And in the process, that intel dramatically slowed the Allies' advance on Berlin. So, either Josephine didn't really exist, and their supposed handler Kramer simply made up absolutely perfect intelligence around Arnhem, or Josephine was real.
Blunt handed over 1,700 documents to his Russian handlers while he was working for them during the Second World War, and we barely know anything about the content of that material. I mean, that material is locked in the Lubyanka in Moscow. the chances of us really knowing what Blunt got up to, and the other Cambridge spies as well, they really got up to, and the damage that they did do to Britain will probably never ever be told. And as a consequence, Blunt is still largely remembered as an art historian who, for all the wrong reasons, got involved with intelligence, spying matters. We haven't really established the degree of his treachery and his culpability in terms of the end of the Second World War.
You can read all about Robert Verkaik's trail from Dutch triple agent Christian Lindemans to Agent Josephine and Anthony Blunt in his new book, The Traitor of Arnhem. I'm Rhiannon Needs. Join us next time for another dangerous liaison with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
People will catch me smiling when I'm talking about certain issues more so than others, because that's how my brain is calming it down. I think the same thing rings true coming face to face with a terrorist. That's very traumatic, obviously. But I think because that was like my trauma response is probably what I did. But looking back on it, it probably helped me in terms of either disarming people or catching people so off guard with a different kind of personality than what I think they probably expected, that sometimes they let their guard down, and it helps me get the information that I need.
True Spies, The Debrief from Spyscape Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.